Hey everyone, this is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. I'm Lil, a behavioral neuroscientist, psychological health and safety leader, and ACC ICF certified coach. You're tuned into the stories segment. Thanks for joining along. And I really want to thank all of you that have been listening from the beginning and have heard me share a number of stories. Some happy ones, some funny ones, some embarrassing ones, and some difficult ones. I know that this comes with a big ask of you, and it can be a lot to receive. So thank you for being on the journey with me and embracing me in all of the many stories that I share. Today I'm going to share with you a couple of stories of some difficult conversations or interactions, and some of them are kind of funny and some of them are less so. And I appreciate you being along and receiving all of them. The first story that I'm going to share comes from when I led a hospital's smoke-free grounds policy. And this was before the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, where it became the regulation for all hospitals to be smoke-free. And the hospital that I worked at is one of the largest mental health hospitals in the province. And being a mental health hospital, we know that a number of our patients smoked. And the approach we took was one not of enforcement, but more of coaching to drive the behavior we wanted to see. And so a part of my role at the time was to talk to people and approach people who were smoking on hospital grounds to remind them to please move over if they so could. For all intents and purposes, this is in the before time. So when I talk about smoke-free, I'm referring to vapes and all the other things that can be smoked. And I used to have a very specific way of approaching people. And it always started from a safety-first mindset. So if I noticed somebody who was smoking on hospital grounds, I always tried to approach them, to make eye contact first, to say hello and see how they would engage. And based on how they interacted to me, I chose and made decisions about whether I was going to have that conversation or not. There were times when I could tell that that wouldn't be the right time for the conversation, or somebody who seemed to be having a really difficult day. And other times when people would be quite happy to say hello. And in those situations, I would have the conversation, and usually it sounded something like, hey, just wanted to let you know that the hospital is actually smoke-free. If it's okay, I'm happy to point you to where you can go to smoke. And most people were pretty good about this. But it was always a difficult conversation, in the sense that it took courage, it felt uncomfortable, and sometimes did result in some not so favorable responses. I do want to share one funny side story to that, which is the way that we approached this was it couldn't just be me. And this particular hospital had a group of people called community ambassadors who would walk around the campus of the hospital and share a number of messages, not just about smoke-free grounds, although that was a big part of their role, but it really needed to be all of us reinforcing that message and trying to keep that conversation going. So the funny story that I wanted to share is that there was a bit of this commentary that when people were around and when the hospital was more populated with people throughout the day, these conversations were happening more regularly. But when it was more of a skeleton staff or fewer staff available, that people did take some more liberties. And so this story, and it's one that always makes me laugh, came from a hospitalist who shared with me that it was Christmas Eve, I believe, so December 24th, and this was outside of one of the hospital units. And one of the clients was standing completely with his pants down, stepped out of his clothing, and urinating against the building. And so when she approached him and said, "Hey, excuse me," he very confusedly looked at her and said, "What? I'm not smoking." So I always like that story because it reminds me about the power of repeated messaging, and that even in these situations, there are funny moments that can come up. So that's one example of a conversation that I had to have for several years and still do. I live not far from that hospital and I have been around the area for a while. And as I walked through the campus a little while ago, there was somebody smoking on the campus and I leaned into my old ways and did pass that message along. And it was really encouraging actually to hear that that person says, "Oh yeah, I know, I've heard that before." Because when there's more of us singing from the same song sheet, it makes it easier for difficult messages to be heard and received. And there are a lot of difficult things happening in the world right now, being experienced by a number of people. Just in the last little while, I feel like I've had a number of conversations with whether it's coworkers or friends about whether it's concerns around financial challenges, people, perhaps because I talk about grief, sharing their own stories of grief and loss, or concern for another person, or their children, or other people in their lives. And recently, I've also had a number of conversations where people have asked me the question of why I mention 988. So for those of you that have heard the podcast before and made it through the credits, you've probably heard me mention 988, which is a suicide crisis hotline. In Canada, 988 is sponsored by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, and the Public Health Agency of Canada. And the reason that I mention 988 is because suicide is almost this Voldemort word. We don't even like to hear it. It's one that causes some distress to hear, and it can remind people of some very difficult things. Grief and death in general is similar to that, but suicide seems particularly to cause that reaction. And there was a Radiolab podcast episode that came out just this week about 988 in the States and the history of how it came to be. And one of the things they talk about in that episode is how one of the things they observed was that people just wanted to be heard. They called the line for a multitude of reasons, but where they found the most success was where people felt they had the space to be listened to. And we know that people want to have a voice, to be heard, to be seen as important, and to believe they have value. And if somebody is contemplating something like suicide, then if we don't even say the word, we don't make it safe for them to ever describe or disclose their pain to us. And so part of the reason I talk about 988, even though we don't necessarily talk about suicide specifically on this podcast, or at least haven't yet, is because you never know who's going to be listening. And I really hold this belief that messages and people and things find people at a moment they're meant to. So having it as part of this podcast is one of the ways that I try to raise awareness of the existence of 988, to remind people that there are safe spaces for these conversations. And also because as someone who is often called by friends, family, colleagues, when situations like this arise, it's helpful to know you don't have to do it alone. So once again, the number is 988, and it is available all across Canada as well as in the States to support people who may be experiencing suicidal ideation and need somebody in a space to be heard. And the other reason I share that is because we are so other-oriented. We often want to help others. In fact, working in the field of mental health, something that so often gets asked of me is by people who say, I'm really concerned for a friend or a family member or my child, and what can I do to support them? So often people want to help others, but don't know how to, or even if the person on the receiving end wants that. So another story that I want to take a moment to share with you now is a story where actually I was on the receiving end of a difficult conversation. And one that I really want to take a moment and offer my gratitude to this person for having with me, because it's changed my life in a number of significant ways. So the context to this story is that I was an angsty 16-year-old teenager, and it was before the time of living with Irene, but this story is actually related to her daughter, Corinne. Corinne is one of my best friends and has been one of my best friends for over the last 25 years of my life at this point. She's someone who's come to mean so very much to me and has changed my life as a result of this one difficult conversation. So the context here is that at this point in my life, I was really hanging on to a lot of difficulties in my life and the things that weren't going so well. I think if I'm really reflecting on it, I had been sucked into a bit of a victim mindset because so much had already felt to be going off track in my life, and I was consumed by a lot of the things that felt to be unfair. And those things are legitimate and valid. There was a lot of things that happened in my early years of life that were quite unfair and that I don't feel I was deserving of. But how I was showing up in them was one where I was failing to see any of the good that was happening around me. If 9 great things happened, but one negative thing did, then I was completely overcome by that. Instead of focusing on the moments that gave me joy, I really hyperfixated on those difficulties. And frankly, looking back, I can see that I was pretty difficult to be around. And I remember having this conversation with Corinne where I must have been rehashing my disappointments and my frustrations about a number of things. And I noticed her getting quieter and a bit more withdrawn from the conversation, which wasn't our norm. And I remember pausing to say, "What's going on?" And in that moment, she gave me some very difficult medicine, but it was exactly what I needed to receive. She said, "I love you, but you are really hard to be around." And in that moment, I was furious, completely furious. How dare she? Doesn't she know what I have been through? I was mad, and I stayed mad for a good amount of time, but she was right. And it wasn't until I really sat back and reflected on what she shared and received that feedback and saw the impact that I was having on somebody who I love and have continued to love for all of these years, that I saw that spending that time with her in my rumination of the things that were hard and painful, rather than seeing all of the efforts and the love that she was giving me, invalidated her and also made me quite difficult to be around. It was that moment of courage for her to share that feedback with me and to share that observation that changed my life and set me on a path of being more intentional in what I'm paying attention to and how I'm spending my energy. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that when things happen or don't go the way I'm expecting them to, that I don't get affected by them. But now I'm much more reflective about what those things mean and represent to me versus just letting the small stuff get in my way. And when the things come up that break my heart, I can validate myself more and hear that as something important to me, something that matters, without automatically defaulting into letting it consume me and letting it be what defines my soul reality. And I know there are lots of people in the world right now dealing with some very legitimate things, whether that be financial challenges or dealing with loss or grief, or being concerned about a coworker or a friend or a child or a parent. There feels to be a lot of hurt and suffering in the world, and how we show up matters. So thank you, Corinne, for sharing that difficult feedback. Like I said, it was the medicine I needed, but I know that was not easy for you to share, and it has made all the difference in my life. I really appreciate it. So we're going to spend a bit more time in the concept, going through a few steps about how someone can go about being a good listener, holding some space, and supporting through difficult conversations. And to be specific about it, these are the types of difficult conversations that wouldn't necessarily be inclusive of the type of suffering or pain that would necessitate a call to 988. They're just the day-to-day conversations. They're the ways we show up to somebody when they're not feeling their best. They're the moments we hold to make it safe for someone to say, "I'm not having my best day." Because whether you're having an apple day and just needing a space to be heard, or a really hard day, when we feel like we have to do it alone, it creates loneliness and shame. And in a world that is so hungry and needing of community, this is one way to show up in that. So thanks for tuning in. We're going to head on over now to the concept segment and unpack this in a little bit more detail. But once again, I really do want to appreciate and acknowledge you for being on the journey with me and being part of the group of people listening to my stories on the good days, the bad days, the hard days, and all the days in between. Thanks for being on this journey with me. This is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. Hey everyone, this is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. You're tuned into the concept segment. Like I shared in the stories, today we're going to be talking about holding space for having difficult conversations and some of the best practice ways to do this. And to be really clear, I know I mentioned this in the stories segment, these are intended to be practices for supporting and holding space for somebody, but doesn't mean that you're expected to be their counselor or therapist. Many of you listening are not that, and if you are, that's great, although that's still not what you're expected to do when it is your friends and family. But this is just about showing up for people when they share something hard, Or maybe even starting a conversation with somebody like Corinne did, if you're noticing that somebody hasn't been quite themselves. And even though we're talking about having conversations with other people, the first step to this is to really notice what is happening in you. We so often dissociate from what we feel, focusing instead on rationalizing or thinking about things. And we can make things a lot about ourselves. We sometimes overly relate, and when people share things with us, we bring it back to our own experiences, which can lead to us making a lot of assumptions based on our own beliefs, our experiences, our situations. And so if we are getting ready to have a conversation with somebody or support somebody through a difficult conversation, it's about starting with noticing what is happening inside you first. And part of the reason I say that is because when someone shares something with us, that can be hard to receive. Maybe they share with us that are having a difficult family situation, or that a child is unwell, or that there's something going on with their parents. We can sense that we have an internal discomfort within ourselves, because that can be hard to receive. And sometimes how that can show up is by trying to solution or fix for other people, or we can dismiss or minimize. Brené Brown, in her Empathy versus Sympathy YouTube short, calls it silver lining things. So that's where we say, it's too bad Sally's flunking out of school, but at least Jenny's a great student. Sometimes we can also freeze. Somebody shares something with us really big, and we don't know how to respond, and we're scared of what to say or upsetting them, and so we just say nothing. And all of those states and all of those reactions are ultimately about alleviating our own discomfort. But when we show up in that way, we're forgetting that this is about being there for the other person. We're getting trapped in our own thoughts and our own loops, our own reactions, our triggers, and our automatic thinking patterns. So for me, something that stands out is the heartstring triggers. These are the things that somebody says something and it just breaks your heart. It automatically activates for me a need to try to fix or solution or help. And if I'm not checking in on my body, and if I'm letting my amygdala get completely overtaxed in that moment, overwhelmed, then I can go into rationalizing and stop showing up for that person in that moment because I've made it about reducing my own discomfort. So I've really been trying to notice when these moments come up, what is happening in my body, and also whether I'm overthinking. Because overthinking, I read this online the other day, I don't remember where, but I read, it was probably a meme, which is what I call memes, that overthinking is underfeeling. And when we get into these states, whether it's amygdala overwhelm or whether it's these overthinking patterns, we've made it completely about ourselves. And in that moment, we leave that person without the support they need, which is often simply to be heard, seen, or feel less alone in whatever they're sharing with you. A friend recently was sharing that he got some news about a medical situation that was really concerning to him. And luckily, we now know that he's okay and everything is going to be fine, but at the time, he didn't know that. And I remember asking him, have you talked to anyone else about this? And his answer was, no. I've just been thinking about it and playing it over and ruminating in my own head. And when that happens, that can be a really scary place. It adds loneliness and isolation to fear, and it creates and exacerbates these problems to be worst-case scenarios. In what he shared, there was nothing I could have said to fix or solution it. At the time, what he thought was happening was very scary, and the best I could do to be there for him was to hear him, to see him, and to validate that that in fact is something very scary. But we're not always perfect at this. And we are human beings who are automatically going to be thinking about things from our own perspectives because it's the one we know. So like I shared with the hospital story earlier, timing really matters. And how and when we have these conversations really matters. And noticing our physical states in those moments. Are we in halts? Are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired, sleepy, scared, or stressed? So when it's a conversation, let's say that somebody springs on us and shares with us, it's about checking in and saying, is this a good time for me? Or is there an alternative we can suggest to somebody? And it can be a really hard thing to do because we want to be there for that person. And we also have to make it safe for ourselves. Thinking about this as a yes and honors both things. It can sound like, this sounds really important and really hard. I want to be there for you and hear you right now. And I have had a day and don't think I'm in the best place or state or ability to be fully present with you. Or it could be something like, I need to process what was just shared and I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed or just need a moment. Can you give me a minute? Or I really want to be in this with you and I don't know how to. Is there someone else we can talk to together? It could be a friend, a professional, a healthcare provider. And I realize that feels really strange to do and can bring on feelings of guilt or shame, especially if we feel like we're letting someone down. But how can we ever really be there for someone else if we aren't being there for ourselves? Our relationship with ourselves is the only one we have full control over. And our actions, reactions, and responses are the only things within our control, not those of others. If it's something that you're trying to invite somebody into, maybe sharing something difficult, it's about asking that person if they have the capacity for it in that moment. Finding a time and a place that works for both parties where possible. Sharing with somebody, hey, I'm going through something right now. Do you have time to sit with me and have a bit more of a difficult conversation? It's about picking those moments. And even in the conversation, if we notice that we're getting escalated, it's also about taking pauses, letting our nervous systems regulate as they need to. Because when we are really honest about what's happening inside of us, we show up complete for that conversation. And we don't make it about ourselves, disempowering those that we're really trying to help. So I know we all probably have our own real life examples of this, where somebody comes up to us with something and is sharing something and we automatically go into, hey, have you tried this? The advice monster is something that I'm working very hard to change myself, by the way, as somebody who likes to feel like I'm helping and likes to feel like I have the answers. But what my real life experience has taught me is that when somebody comes up to me with something that they're struggling with and I go into giving advice or my own solutions, often people have considered those things, but they're not doing them for a specific reason. There's a concept called immunity to change, and what this tells you about is that often people know what they need to do, but are continuing to behave and respond in different ways. And that's because we get something out of that, whether that's laziness or familiarity or comfort. There's something in it that serves us. So I'll use a really basic example. Let's say somebody was to say to me, I'm really having a hard time finding time to be present with people that I love. And I might say, have you tried planning? And do you use a calendar? And have you blocked time to do things that give you joy? And those are all things that person probably is aware of. They probably have thought about those situations in the past, or those opportunities, or those tools, or those tactics, but they're not doing it for a specific reason. We get stuck, and we get stuck for reasons that are personal to us. It could be that people are not doing that because they feel like they have to do their work deliverables, or they're overwhelmed with other things, or it's just what's familiar to them. And they believe that by not doing X, Y, or Z, there's another narrative happening in their mind. Because we live in these echo chambers of our own minds. People often know what they need to do, but are stuck somewhere. There's some competing demand or something keeping their energy in where they are. And often what people need to get out of that echo chamber of their own minds is a listening ear, a non-judgmental ear, one that is fully in their service. Essentially, they're inviting us into their worlds. And part of the role we play is to make it safe for them to have that conversation. And for some people, this is really intimidating and can be really hard. It's incredibly vulnerable for people, particularly the males, to say that they may be struggling with something. Males and moms, I'll say, because there is a lot of pressure out there to have it figured out, to not need help, to be strong, and to do it all on your own. And so when we notice that somebody may not be their best self, or showing up the way that we're used to, there's also a kindness to reaching out and saying, I'm concerned about you. You haven't seemed quite like yourself. Is there something that you need some space for? Recently, there was a fellow podcaster named Ken, Scarborough dude, who hosts the Dix and Janes podcast, who talked about this podcast in a very delightful and lovely way. And thank you, Ken. He says is that something that I offer as part of this podcast is advice. And I believe he says it in a really supportive and complimentary way. Or it's received as such anyways. And we will call it a mango moment. And I have just a slightly different opinion on that. I truly see these as practices, and some of them will resonate with people, and others won't. And that's okay. It's about trying different things and seeing what works for people, and what feels good within me. I'm working through some of these practices myself, so this is an opportunity for me to really lean into them and see what works for me and what doesn't. I think that's another part of showing up as a supporter to somebody, is sharing experiences and practices if somebody is willing to receive them, and not measuring whether somebody takes us up on that or not, or leans into a practice or not, as their own choice. People are full and complete people who have agency over what they do. And something I talk a lot about in the workplace is that we own the process, not the outcome, particularly as it relates to supporting people. And what I mean by that is we own the process of creating a safe space, to listening, to providing support, to offering suggestions if it's helpful to that person and invited by that person. But whether somebody takes us up on those is entirely up to them. The point I'm really trying to make is that when we show up in support of somebody who is sharing something, it's about making it about the other person. And if it is a situation where you've noticed that maybe somebody hasn't seemed like their best self, you can say, I'm really concerned about you. I'd love to talk to you about this. Is there a time and a place that would work for you? And we can even invite them into that conversation up front to say, you haven't seemed quite like yourself. Are you feeling all right? Is there something you'd like to talk about? Because they could say something like, oh yeah, I'm just really distracted or busy with this or that. And then we know. And sometimes we can suspect someone is saying they're just busy, or they're caught up with something, or they've just been tired, and believe that that's not really the issue. But until and unless someone wants to share with us, we can't make them. And sometimes people need time to be ready to share. And what you've now created is an invite for that conversation when they're ready. It's the same as any time somebody has reached out to us and maybe offered to connect, but the timing wasn't right for us. Or when someone gives us feedback that maybe we're not ready to receive. We could be not ready for that in that moment, but it's there for us for when we're ready and capable of seeing it. Or in the case of a conversation, it's an opportunity for a bridge to connect. So we have to take people as they come to us. And maybe one nice way to create a bridge of support is to say, it seems like you've had a really busy time, and if you ever need an ear for that or anything else, I'm here for you. We offer that safety by giving people flexibility and control over their situations. But if it's us that's sharing something, we can also create an infrastructure by asking somebody and saying, I haven't felt quite like myself recently. This is a bit hard for me, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. I think it might be best for me if we chatted in person or over the phone or over coffee or whatever it is. Are you open to that? And earlier I talked about checking in with somebody and creating a space for them to tell us whether we're on the right track or not. And it is really important that we not make assumptions. If we want to show up in listening and hearing somebody, that we ask what someone needs. I talk about this a lot in the workplace context to say, if someone comes to you with a problem, it's about asking them, are you looking for me to listen, solution, or take action? And recently I heard that teachers are taught to ask a student if they want someone to hear you, help you, or hug you. And from my experience, most people want to be heard. But when we lead with that solutioning or that helping, that's the advice monster, and that's making it about ourselves. We are not expected or being asked to fix for others. When we do that, we try to exert control over other people, and we only have control over ourselves. And it's about acknowledging that that's about our own discomfort. And in that moment, we are being invited to a moment of support. We are being invited to sit with somebody in a moment to combat loneliness or fear or worry. And the best way to offer that is to be with that person in what they need versus centering and prioritizing ourselves and our needs. Whether that's to be a hero or to avoid our own discomfort or to take away somebody's pain. And in doing that, I think it's really important that we recognize how that can minimize somebody's experience. In the story I shared earlier about the friend of mine sharing that health scare, if what they thought came to fruition, then saying, oh, don't worry about it, you're going to be just fine, may not actually be true, and doesn't give that person the space to say, I'm scared. This is really about being with the other person in those dark spaces. And if you do have advice, if there is something you know to do that you think could really help, ask if it's helpful if you share that. Say, I think I have some idea of what you're talking about. I've tried something before that might be helpful. Are you open to hearing about that? Or is it okay if I share that with you? Or we can even ask them, is there something you've tried before? Because when we do that, we're keeping it about them and honoring what their needs are. And another element here is to really thank people for sharing things with you. It is so hard to share, and it is so hard to invite people into our vulnerabilities. And it takes that emotional maturity and courage to show up here, to use their language, even when it's hard for us to say. Because if they're using certain language, then when we match them in that, we lean into that empathy. And when we're really leaned into that empathy, it's about imagining ourselves in their situation, which can be really difficult to do because most people are suppressing their own feelings. So staying with somebody, honoring them by listening to their words, saying them back to them, confirming your understanding, and noticing your own emotional reactions is a really beautiful way to show up for others. And the next thing here is to really listen and validate. Sometimes when you ask somebody the question of, are you looking for me to listen, solution, or take action? A lot of people really don't know what they need. And if they can't name it, assume listen, and listen actively. It is so rare that people have the space to just be heard, where distractions are removed, where people are really actively listening and attending to a person, noticing their body cues. And just that space sometimes can be clarifying. Because when we say things out loud, sometimes we pick up on things that we hadn't before. Something from my coaching practice that I picked up from the fabulous Kelly Wood is that people will find something to fill that silence with, and it often will give you a deeper layer of that onion. So pausing and allowing somebody to complete their thought, to see if there's something else. I remember reading this article. I think the name of the article was One More Thing, or One Last Thing. And what it talked about was often people showed up or presented to their family doctor with a specific point. You know, they want to get a mole checked out, or they have a specific thing that they're in there for. But at the end of the meeting, doctors that were trained to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to share with me? Those that asked that question, what they found was that there were other things, other health concerns that were showing up for people that wouldn't have been heard if they didn't hold that space and allow for that silence. And often when we jump in to fill silence, it's about our own discomfort. So we can do that delicately while still honoring a person by saying things like, this is so hard. I can't even imagine what you're going through. That's a lot. Because when we do that, we validate. We can share what we're hearing and put ourselves in that situation without trying to minimize, solution, or fix. And really, often what people want or need to hear is that their pain is valid, that their fear is valid. Even if the reason they got there is their own narrative or story, the emotions they feel are real. If you think back to our apple and mango day, if somebody was to share with you the story of watching somebody walk by and they were having an apple day, and you said, well, you know, there might have been a million other things going on. That may be true, but that person is feeling overlooked and sharing that feeling with you. They're sharing that hurt with you. And we can validate that even when we don't agree with the facts of the situation. Because it's the feeling that's real. And talking may not take away that pain, but it makes us feel less alone in it. And when emotions are not validated, the risk is that they can become implosions or explosions. Implosions are situations where you can become more self-doubting, more self-critical. They're more inwards pointing. And explosions tend to be more aggression, fear, explosive type reactions, anger. And the antidote for all of that is more listening. Because if we had more listening and more curiosity, people would have a space for their feelings without having to internalize them, without them going into those echo chambers, and without them manifesting in these larger-than-life reactions. We've gone through a collective struggle together for the last couple of years, and we are coming out of a collective trauma. There are many people who have lived through various stages of isolation and loneliness. We're far more socially isolated than we were before 2020. And we've become almost de-skilled in some of our social skills and reaching out for support. And the risk in that is that people are not showing up in their best selves. Anyone who works in customer service or any customer-facing interaction can probably tell you that there is definitely a different temperament. People are yelling at and behaving quite badly to people in customer service. And coming from a trauma-informed approach, if we took a step back and asked the question of what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, we can lean in with that empathy. And when it's people in our lives and people that we love and care about, showing up in spaces that allow for more listening is one really powerful way to do that. So 2 more things here, and then we're going to get into our practice. I've already alluded to this, but you own the process, not the outcome, is something that I feel I need to say again. People, and especially adults, are full and complete. We only own our own actions, our own choices, and our own accountabilities. We have to recognize that people have personal agency and have to get there when they get there. When Corinne shared her feedback to me all those years ago, I wasn't ready to receive it. I was mad. We didn't actually speak for a couple of months. But when I really digested what she had to say, and when I really heard it as coming from somebody who cares about me, it allowed me to hear that hard message. And owning the process, not the outcome, takes a lot of discipline. Because it is so hard when we see somebody we love struggling. But when we lean into trying to fix or solution for them, we are making that about ourselves. And we suggest things to try to reduce our own hurt. So being aware of these motivations allows us to validate ourselves and let us know that this means we care. This means we love that person. I have a number of conversations with people who share with me how concerned they are about others. And they say, I see that they're really not helping themselves. And if they only did this, this, and this. But if that person's not ready to be there, there's nothing we can do to get them there. And this goes back to the power of listening. Because when we lean in with advice giving and solutioning, we're not listening. And everyone needs a space to be heard. Because even when life is good, it's still hard. And part of that hard is feeling alone. And if every time they talk to somebody, they get a whole list of suggestions that maybe don't work for them, or that they're not ready to embrace, then it's only going to further isolate us. And the one last thing I'll say is, there may be some people in your lives that are coming to you for supports and maybe saying, I want your solutions or I want your help, but they never take them. And there may be some people for whom that listening and that support is never enough. And in those really difficult moments, it is really important that we are honoring our own boundaries. This also looks like gently and lovingly letting someone know when you feel like you can't support them as they need you to. This is really hard. You can say something like, I'm not sure I'm the best person to help you with this. It's okay to recognize your limits. Professionals and coaches, myself included, have to do this at times. When someone's showing up with something that's outside of our scope or something that isn't within us to support in, even if it's because it's personally difficult for us, for example, it is a service to someone that you share with them your own limits. It's a kindness, really. And it's a disservice to take things on that you're not able to yourself and others. And that's the last thing I really want to comment on here, which is about the aftercare following these conversations. When we have difficult conversations with people, we need to check in with ourselves afterwards. You can't pour from an empty cup. And often these conversations are exhausting to us. And it is critical that we intentionally recharge. And when I say recharge, I mean with basic necessities that we sometimes overlook. Water, food, nourishing movement, things that our bodies literally need as fuel, rest, quiet, moments to reflect on the impact that conversation had on you. Because especially if it's a conversation where somebody's coming to you for help or support, but never taking you up on it and you feel like you're on this hamster wheel with them, there's important information in there about what boundaries we may need and how we can show up for ourselves so that we can keep that energy high. And on the topic of boundaries, and I mentioned this earlier, but we are not expected to be people's counselors or therapists. You are not expected to handle more than you are capable of. So part of it is where there is an opening for it, directing to other resources, offering to go along with them to appointments if that works for you, sharing information about resources they may not know about. And part of it too is giving ourselves permission to talk to someone, because these situations can be really difficult on us. And often we try to soak up everyone else's pain and show up for others, but we don't give that same grace and compassion to ourselves. And finally, in connecting it back to you own the process, not the outcome, trust that you are doing your best. This is about a practice, not perfection. It's not about getting it right all the time. We're human. We do these things imperfectly. But trusting that you are doing your best to be there is really, really powerful. So to summarize some of what we talked about today, in showing up for somebody in difficult conversations, it's about starting with noticing what is happening inside of you, how you are showing up, what you are bringing to the table. The second is about intentionally making it about the other person, not our own discomfort or our own need to solution, fix, and be the heroes. The third is about listening and validating, being curious, asking questions, not trying to solution and fix. The fourth is about owning the process, not the outcome, remembering that people are whole and complete, have personal agency, and are responsible for what they do in their lives. And the fifth is about aftercare and setting boundaries, because that's a lot to pour out in support of somebody else, and how we recharge equally matters. So thanks for being part of this journey with me. This is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. Hey everyone, this is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. Thanks for tuning into the practice segment. Before I get into the practice, I've received questions from the concept around setting boundaries through difficult conversations, and specifically about when listening just becomes endless venting and doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So a number of people have said, okay, so I show up for people and I listen and I support, but it seems like they're not willing to make any changes or listen to any advice, or really it just gets kind of toxic and becomes more about venting. And what do you do in that space? And I commented on this in the concept segment, but I'll share a few more things just for the purpose of further clarity. The thing I really want to say here is that you can't make somebody change or want to do something. And some people do get stuck. They get stuck in their rumination, or they get stuck in their hurt or their pain. And in situations like that, one of the kindest things to do is to gently pause and say, I've heard you. I can see how difficult this is for you. I see how painful it is. So where do we go from here? Or something to the effect of, I'm not sure what more I can do. Is there anything else I can do for you today? Those gentle nudges to somebody help to stop the rumination cycle, or at least pause it, and gives you a chance to redirect them. But you own the process, not the outcome. And people need to get to their own place of readiness before they're willing to confront or make some of these changes. I talked about this in the concept, but I'll say it again. For some people, the desire for comfort or the familiar or what they know is more comfortable than making a change, even if it is what they want. And also, it's about remembering that for some people, a level of support that you give is never going to be enough. Because what they're really looking for is the desire and motivation to change, but they may not be there, and it's not yours to give them. In the coaching space, we say that for somebody to be coachable on a specific topic, they have to have a desire for change, or really a dissatisfaction with the current state. Often when someone is venting or sharing, they have a dissatisfaction with the current state, but then they may be missing the next two pieces, which is a vision for the future, or really a knowledge of what they want to achieve. And the next is the willingness to do the work. We know from the addictions literature that you can't convince someone they need to change. You can't convince somebody that they need help. It's the mind that holds the problem, that holds the solution. So using myself as an example here, in the feedback that Corinne gave me, I had a role to play to get out of that mindset, but I wasn't ready to get there until I really reflected on what she said and saw the impact that my mindset, and in particular my negativity bias, and how it was showing up. But once I noticed it, I could really attune to when it was happening. And when it was happening, I could slow things down to make a choice.
about what I was seeing in that moment or maybe not seeing. And that's what started the gateway for me to make those changes. But if she had just said to me what she said and left it to me and expected that I would use that to change my mindset, it wouldn't happen. We so often try to change people, but change doesn't happen unless they want it to. That desire for change or dissatisfaction with the current state, the vision for the future and what they want to achieve, and the willingness to do the work. So that's the first question that I've had around how do I set healthy boundaries? And the other question that I've gotten, or the other comment, is when I'm approaching somebody, what if they get mad at me? And feeling afraid or scared that saying to somebody, hey, I've noticed that you haven't been yourself, or maybe I'm concerned about you, will make them upset. And my response to that is we don't control people's reactions. And it's pretty hard to argue with somebody saying, I care about you, I'm concerned about you, I just want to check in. And if we give feedback or share that and somebody is upset, we have to recognize that that has more to do with them than it does with us. To use my own story as an example here, when the feedback was given to me, I was upset. And I was upset for a while, but it was the medicine I needed. And that's the medicine that tastes the worst going down, but is the one we need the most. If we really care about someone, we have to prioritize our care and compassion for them, because that's what's within our control, over their reaction. And we have to understand that sometimes people have to get there at their own time. When our intention is to show up in love and kindness, we have to trust that our own intentions are about supporting somebody rather than upsetting them or making them feel hurt. So those were the two common things that I had asked of me in reaction to the concept segment. And in this practice segment, we're actually going to shift gears a little bit to talk about how we can support ourselves. We do so much listening to other people, but we very infrequently sit and listen to ourselves, to really hear where we're at, to treat ourselves like a friend. And now we'll talk through some strategies of how we go about sharing, because it can be really hard to know where to start. And the first thing I'll say before I get into this is it is perfectly okay to ask for help or support. We evolved as social creatures, and we need others to help us see different perspectives. We have to realize that we can't do it alone. In evolving as social creatures, it's about knowing how we leverage our communities. We live in this very individualistic society that has told us that hyper-independence is what's strong and how we achieve, and that is great for some things, but not when it relates to things that involve other people. We also know that we have repeated narratives that are influenced by our automatic thinking patterns. And so, for example, if you were like me, and earlier in my life where I had that negativity bias, I would very quickly assume that something was the worst or see only the worst in something. Or if you're one of the soloist perfectionist types, you might be thinking, I'm going through something, but I need to do this all on my own. And in doing that, you can really isolate yourself from supports and resources that can help keep you safe and supported in times that are really difficult. Because when we remember that we are talking to ourselves all day, every single second of the day, we have that inner narrative, the voice between our two ears that is telling us things which we often believe as facts. We forget that other things may be true. And the power of conversation is that it can help us get out of ourselves and remind us that we are not alone. So if there's something that you've been sitting with and thinking, maybe I could use an ear, but I really don't know, or I'm not sure where to get started. We know that since 2020 and the beginning of COVID, that people have lost some of their social skills. And we know that generation over generation, the number of people we consider close friends has been shrinking over time. So that can create a lot of barriers to getting help that people really need. And some of the first steps to getting there is to remember that you don't have to do it alone. Remember that talking is helpful, and start by making a list of people that you can talk to. Or even if it's not people you can talk to, just start by making a list of people that you consider yourself feeling safe with. And if you're in a situation where you think you make that list and you don't see anybody on there, or there isn't anyone that you feel safe with, then look at what other supports you do have available to you. In my workplace, we have something called an Employee and Family Assistance Program. This is professional help that is confidential and often no cost or low cost. I know that in the city I live in, access to supports often means long wait lists and is also very expensive. And if you have employee programs through your workplace, use them. I know it can be really tricky. I've used the service a number of times before, and the first person that you get matched up with isn't always the best fit. That's certainly been my case, and part of it is it can be really hard to advocate for yourself in these situations, but it is so important that you do that. So I've called back in and said, I'm not sure this person is who I am best matched with. Is there somebody else that I could be matched with? And sometimes it's taken 3 or 4 times to find the right person, but we know that the best outcomes come from having a good rapport with the person you're speaking with. So I know it adds an additional burden, and especially if you're coming from a place where you're feeling already defeated, but doing nothing is certainly not going to change things. And the nice thing about it too is, especially if you're leveraging in professional support, is sometimes we feel like we have nothing to say or we don't know where to start. But these are people that are trained to ask questions and solicit and invite your point of view, and you might be surprised what comes out. One of the nicest stories I have in my mind right now comes after a difficult workplace situation that happened, speaking with a colleague who was involved in the situation and inviting them into the conversation by saying, "I'd really love to talk to you, no pressure as to when, but I'm here." And it actually took him a little while to get back to me and to take me up on it. But when he did, we ended up talking for an hour and a half. Because when we have safety in speaking and when we feel safe with somebody, it can create the environment that makes us comfortable to say things out loud, which sometimes is the first time we're even seeing or acknowledging those things for ourselves. And when we hear ourselves talk out loud sometimes, and when we have that space and runway, it can surprise us what comes out. I know for me, one of the barriers that's previously stopped me from feeling like I can talk to somebody or that anyone would even want to listen is frankly a vulnerability and an insecurity that maybe what I had to say didn't matter, or that nobody would care what I had to say, or that it was burdensome or bothering other people. And that's a really hard thing to overcome. And another reason why using the professional supports available to you can be one way around that. But watch out. Sometimes once you start talking, you can't stop, or at least that's what happened to me. And here we are now. Joking aside though, talking really can help. And it's not just about the words we use, but just the space for the reflection to sit and think about what narratives you're telling yourself and what you believe in that moment. And also sometimes hearing something out loud and having somebody else say it to us can help us validate our own emotions and offer that self-compassion to ourselves. So starting by making a list of who you can talk to, whether it's a friend or a professional support, helps you have some tools at your fingertips so that when you're ready to talk to somebody, and again, that readiness really matters, but sometimes having the things that can enable that conversation or that readiness just helps to get us there faster. And so once you've made that list, it's about really sitting and reflecting about what you need from that conversation. And the same way as how when we were talking about supporting others, there was the, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to give advice? Or do you want me to take action? We can actually ask ourselves that same question. We can say to ourselves, what is it that I am really looking for? Am I looking for someone to hear me? Am I looking for someone to give me advice? Or am I looking for someone to do something, to support me? And when you heard me talk about this in the context of supporting somebody else, that might have resonated, or at least it has when I've shared it with other people. But isn't it interesting how we don't spend that same amount of time asking ourselves those types of questions? And it really does go back to that cultivating the relationship with ourselves. When we really go into something clear about what it is we're looking for, if it's just to be heard, for example, then this also helps us show up and ask for that help in a way that is helpful to the person we're asking that of. Because when people don't know, they make assumptions and fill in the gaps, and we have a role to help them help ourselves. And so further to that, if you know what it is you're looking for, let's say it is advice or listening, it is a gift to tell that other person what you need when you reach out. And that's the next step we're going to talk about here. So if you've made your list of people that you can talk to and you're thinking about, Okay, so what do I do from here? This is really uncomfortable. How do I reach out to that person? I would suggest you make contact in a way that is comfortable for you, whether that be sending a text message or an email or maybe a phone call. And it's just about making the ask for help. You can say something like, I haven't been feeling like myself recently. I could really use your perspective, or I'd love your ear. Is that something you're open to? You're inviting them into it. You're asking them whether they have the capacity to support you in that situation. And I think the thing is, we have to sometimes understand that people are dealing with their own life situations. And so somebody may want to show up for us, but may not be able to in that moment. And that's okay. It's about understanding that that's not about us. And if they do say yes, then it's about thinking about how to make that situation safe for both parties. So that might look something like, I haven't been feeling like myself recently, or I've just not been my best. I could really use a friend. Are you open to a phone call? And if they say yes, then when might work for you that would be a good time for you to be present. And it's also about thinking about the environment and situations we need to make that safe. So when we really set up the conversation in that way, when we are going into it with the specific ask of what it is we're looking for, when we're inviting them and asking if they have the capacity for that, and then co-creating that safety, we've done a lot of the work to start the conversation on the right foot and to set us up for the best outcomes possible. And on the topic of outcomes, it's about remembering that no one can fix something for you, and that often the things we're bringing into conversations aren't that person's to control or own. So it's not about the fixing, but it's about being less alone in our thoughts or in our fears. I know I've had conversations with people where I've encouraged them to talk to somebody, whether it's EFAP or another provider. What I have heard when I've offered that as an option to people is, yeah, I talked to them, but it didn't fix anything. It didn't change anything. Or they might say, well, that didn't help. I'm still in the same situation. But often there's but it was helpful to be heard. And I think this goes back to being really clear on what it is that you are looking for out of a conversation and having realistic expectations about what's going to come from it. Because often the things we bring in are too big to be fixed. And if they could have been fixed, they probably would have been. But there are things that are either representative of deep wounds or things that are outside of our control. And just having a space to feel less alone in them can be really powerful. So even when we don't think something helped, sometimes it did, if it helped to make us feel more connected. And that's why that therapeutic rapport is so important when we talk about treatment outcomes and getting along with the person you're connecting with, because ultimately it's about having a sense of connection versus the solutioning or fixing of a problem. And the last thing here is about remembering that it can be hard. It takes a lot of vulnerability to show up and a lot of authenticity to share our fears, our hopes, our dreams, our pains. And so it's also about being kind to ourselves, remembering that it takes courage. Even for someone like me who is very out there and talks a lot about very real and personal things to me, it takes courage every single time. And it's about the aftercare and what I do and what we do to recharge after that situation. Because even if there is connection that comes out of those scenarios or situations, they still take a lot out of us. And it's about leaning into that self-care and supporting ourselves so that it continues to be safe and supportive for us to show up. So to summarize, some of the ways that we can show up for ourselves and invite supports when we need it are by starting by realizing we can't do it all on our own, remembering that social connections can help to support us, remembering that you are talking to yourself all the time anyways, and that there may be things that you are not seeing. And once you give yourself that permission, it's about making a list of people or supports that you can talk to, making a list of their contact numbers so that you know where you can go. And from there, it's about really asking yourself what you're looking for them to do, whether it's listen, take action, or give advice. And then once you know that, the next step is to make the invitation, make contact, reach out and ask specifically for what you need. Assess their capacity by asking them if they can support you in that way. From there, it's about creating an infrastructure of safety, focusing about the environment and how to make it safe for both parties, and remembering that no one can fix for you. And finally, it's about being kind to yourself, offering yourself that self-compassion, and leaning into your aftercare. And speaking of breaks, on behalf of Brandon and I, we would really like to thank you for being along this journey with us. It has been an absolute pleasure and a blast. And we're going to keep it going, but we are taking a small break while we figure out where we go from here. So thank you so much for being on this journey with us. It's been a pleasure so far, and we can't wait to see you again soon. This is Lil, and you're listening to Lil On Life. Talk soon.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please like, follow, and leave a 5-star review. If you'd like to reach out, you can get me on my Gmail at lilonlifepod@gmail.com. That's Lil with one L, onlifepod@gmail.com. Or on my socials at Lil On Life Pod. Lil On Life Podcast is produced by Brando & Co. Brandon is a photographer, director, and podcast producer. You can see some of his creations on Instagram at Brandon Allen. Get in touch to see how you can collaborate. Opinions expressed in this podcast are my own and may not reflect those of my employers. If you or someone you know is in danger, please dial 911. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, call or text 988. Support is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That number again is 988. Lil On Life is a Big B and Little L collaboration.